CoinCenter's main day-to-day work, our #1 mission priority, is always to defend the developers of open blockchain networks from inappropriate regulations or unjust prosecutions. I think it's becoming more and more self-evident that a transparent layer 1 is not a neutral layer 1, not in the long run. Ultimately, transparency will destroy neutrality. And this is not me saying that we should be building things that enable money laundering. It's me saying, no, we should build global neutral communications networks for things like underlying settlement. This was true of SWIFT in the 80s. It was neutral. If we're going to build a better system, we should be building more like SWIFT used to be and less like what SWIFT's becoming, where it's just a fully mediated underlying settlement ledger even for messages for settling transactions, let alone transactions themselves.
We're here at DevConnect, and today we're speaking with Peter live and in color. It's nice to see you here.
I should have worn a more expressive outfit.
Yeah, I think we're all a little bit drab,
Yeah.
but I think it's okay. Kind of like the background makes up for it. So it's a little, for everyone who's listening to this, it's a little trippy, but it's trippy and kind of
Creepy AI flaw. Yeah, there's probably AI. There's some tech in there that's definitely ChatGPT's idea of words.
How has Buenos Aires treated you so far?
Oh, it's been great. I think one of the, and it's become sort of widely discussed, one of the interesting things about DevCon this year, or DevConnect, or whatever, the big Ethereum conference this year, is that privacy is actually being discussed more fully. And, CoinCenter, my organization, has been trying to focus people's attention on the need for financial privacy and the need to protect the builders of financial privacy for over 11 years now. And sometimes there's periods in that history where you're like, yay, like Zcash or things like that. And sometimes there's periods where it's like, okay, everything's going to be done with stablecoins on chain, and we'll have full transparency into all transactions. And that's what will tell law enforcement why they don't have to worry about the technology, because it's a panopticon. And now we're kind of swinging back to like, oh, well, actually, maybe that would be bad. Not just for the criminals. We want it to be bad for the criminals, but actually bad for all legitimate uses of the technology as well, because who wants to use a global financial system where every time you buy a can of Coke, a billboard pops up with your name? It's like, Peter just bought a can of Coke, everyone. It's bad. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Gnosis, building the open internet one block at a time. Gnosis was founded in 2015, and it's grown from one of Ethereum's earliest projects into a powerful ecosystem for open user-owned finance. Gnosis is also the team behind products that have become core to my business and that of so many others, like Safe and CowSwap. At the center is Gnosis Chain. It's a low-fee layer 1 with 0 downtime in 7 years and secured by over 300,000 validators. It's the foundation for real-world financial applications like Gnosis Pay and Circles. All of this is governed by Gnosis DAO, a community-run organization where anyone with a GNO token can vote on updates, fund new projects, and even run a validator from home. So if you're building in Web3, or you're just curious about what financial freedom can look like, start exploring at gnosis.io.
How much of that do you think the interest in privacy is driven by market movements, or is it like the demand for privacy that's driving markets, or is it the markets that's driving privacy? Yeah, it's probably the markets driving privacy. Because, as much as I would like to, as an advocate, as a lawyer, as a person who stands up for what we should, normatively what we should have, you can be like, build privacy, and people are like, why would I build something no one's going to use? And the thing that infuriates me more than anything else at all of these conferences, I meet all these great people, and usually they're like, oh, how can we stay in touch after we leave this conference? And they're like, do you have Telegram? And I say to them, why would I use Telegram? Like, the strange, half-baked, not encrypted for group chats and vaguely encrypted for individual chats platform where they rolled their own hash functions. That's a disaster. We've had Signal for decades now. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you using Signal?
Yeah.
And it's because people don't take their privacy seriously. Ordinary consumers don't take their privacy seriously, especially people who are new to crypto or new to blockchains that we all want to onboard now. They have no idea.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. They're time constrained. They're not sophisticated. But the thing that bugs me is that sophisticated people who've been coming to DevCon for multiple years, people in the Ethereum community are like, let's let's just give all our information to the Russian Secret Service, which has compromised this app, and the French intelligence services as well, right? I mean, like that's just odd. Why wouldn't we use Signal anyway?
I mean, I think there's a good reason why people didn't use Signal up until recently, and maybe
It's bad for creating a boiler room because the group chat function is complicated.
well, group chat function is complicated, but also up until just a couple years ago, you had to give your phone number.
That's true.
And
That was
the
a-
UI around that was
Yeah.
not great. I think that gave Telegram the opportunity to really like create a huge,
You found a more forgivable argument.
yeah.
I
But also
also-
UI is not great.
The group chat UI was bad. So like people who wanted to like pass insider information about what thing they're gonna pump next, like we're like, let's be on Telegram because we can have a good group chat.
Yeah.
I don't know. So yeah, I think it's market driven not because consumers are demanding it, but because the new potential consumers of like typical consumers, the new potential consumers of blockchains are institutions, and institutions take their shit seriously because if you're JP Morgan or you're a proprietary trading firm or you're whoever, you're not interested in just hemorrhaging all of your information to the public blockchain, because that's not how the traditional financial system ever worked. You have trade secrets, you have practices that you don't want revealed, and that's not because they're nefarious, that's just because how businesses always run. So we have a more serious sort of institutional potential user for this tech, and I think they demand privacy. So I think that's real. I think the other thing that's driving the privacy conversation is also, this is maybe more my biased view, because I come from Washington, D.C., and I see the evolution of these things from a legal standpoint. I think it's becoming more and more self-evident that a transparent layer one is not a neutral layer one, not in the long run. Ultimately, transparency will destroy neutrality, because if you're validating on this chain and you see all this activity, at what point is someone going to run up to you and say, you're kind of culpable for that activity? Like maybe you didn't directly promote it, but you facilitated it, you aided it, you abetted it. Like if you see a multi-sig, or if you see a money laundering transaction, multi-sig money laundering, and you validate that as part of a larger block, what's your long-term argument for you not being complicit? Especially if you could have used Chainalysis as a validator to identify these things, and you didn't. Right? That's called willful blindness in the United States, and it's not a defense to culpability for criminal law. Actual blindness is. And so this is the difference. People say like, well, how will they ever allow Zcash to be a thing, or something with base layer privacy, or Aztec built on top of Ethereum? My answer is like, that's the only thing they will allow, because actual blindness is a defense to crime. Like if you had literally no knowledge of some criminal act that you facilitated, you didn't actually facilitate a criminal act, not with intent to facilitate, and you can't be held culpable, and you shouldn't be held culpable. And so that's the only way to actually have credibly neutral systems, is to have systems that are actually blind to the underlying transactions in the block. I said in my talk the other day, if you really want dumb pipes, you need the pipes to be actually blind to the shit that flows through them, because otherwise it's not a dumb pipe.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot to unpack here. So kind of like I think we should distinguish between kind of absolute privacy and relative privacy, right? So kind of like people kind of regular consumers don't want absolute don't need absolute privacy. So kind of like, or they don't think they need this. So kind of like they have no issue with Telegram reading their stuff, or their bank knowing kind of like where their money goes. They don't want everyone to know it, so they kind of need relative privacy. And I think kind of like that's also something that kind of plays into this a lot. I really feel your discussion point on protocol level blindness, because we recently did a thing on Gnosis chain.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you follow the balancer hack.
A little bit.
So basically, there was a hacker. He was clearly malicious. He stole 128 million across many chains, almost 10 million of which were on Gnosis chain. And there were some attempts to kind of freeze some of it with the freezable stablecoins. And then he concentrated on mainnet and kind of sold positions for ETH. So kind of it gave us a little bit of time to kind of think, what do we do here? Because clearly this is someone who's stolen actual people's money. Kind of like it was stable pools. It wasn't kind of like some sort of degen sort of thing. And it was also a pretty blue chip protocol. So it was Balancer V2 stable pool. So it was, So what we ended up doing is first we kind of asked bridge governors to kind of reduce liquidity so that the hacker wouldn't be able to bridge off Gnosis chain easily. And then we try to get validators on board for a soft fork. Meaning kind of, and I mean, just to kind of clarify, a hard fork is where kind of like we change the state kind of like some time in the past. And a soft fork is basically where everyone agrees to not process certain transactions. So kind of like you don't include them in your block, but you also don't attest to them. And I think not including things in your block, this is something that kind of has been done before and is currently done on Ethereum. But kind of saying, I'm not going to attest to this if it's in there. This is a line that so far hasn't been crossed until now. So until now on Gnosis chain, I'm not proud of this, but kind of like it made us it made us appreciate that kind of like while we still have this power, it's probably arguably the right thing to do, but we still want to get to a place where we do not have this power anymore.
I mean, so one thing I think about a lot lately is the SWIFT interbank settlement network. So that's the Society for Worldwide Interbank Telecommunications.
Oh, is that what that means?
Something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I just learned that.
I was started in Belgium in the 1970s, and the central bankers at the time didn't even know what the heck all this computer nonsense was, and so they were like given an option to have a seat at the table amongst the banks that were developing this interbank settlement tool, and they were like, we don't know, like computers, that's not what banking's about. And SWIFT ends up becoming the most single most important cross-border settlement messaging network. They're not doing the settlement themselves. They're a messaging network. Sounds familiar to a lot of stuff in that space. In the world, they settle 150 trillion in transactions, or they don't settle, they message them so that banks can settle them every year, 150 trillion. And up until 2012, SWIFT was credibly neutral. And if you think about the early days of SWIFT as a messaging network, it's all plain text transactions between their member banks. Their member banks, it's a permission set, but they are credibly neutral in a way because they don't have the computational ability at that point in history or really the wherewithal to accumulate all the messages on their proprietary network and really know who's sending what to who and unwind it all. Like, it's just not something that's feasible. By the time we get to the 90s, the 2000s, of course, it's totally feasible. They know everything that happens on their network. And if they continue to claim to be just a messaging provider, neutral, and that finally breaks down when the U.S. government and the EU Parliament and others say, like, you need to stop relaying messages to Iranian banks who are, facilitating the Iranian government's nuclear program. We have sanctioned them. Until then, SWIFT said, we are not an obligated entity for purposes of U.S. or EU sanctions because we are not actually involved in the underlying economics of the transaction. We are just a messaging provider.
No.
And there's a good reason for that. You want a messaging provider to be globally neutral. Otherwise, we won't have a throughput in the global economy. Every transaction will end up mediated and a whole council will have to decide whether to let it through, and the whole thing collapses. And you fast forward to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and SWIFT removes the Russian banks from SWIFT. And that was in 2022, so we're not long beyond that. To me, there's this slow-moving crisis where SWIFT is going to become a fully mediated, fully obligated global settlement tool for messaging, for settlements, and it just won't have the throughput and viability that a truly neutral tool would have. It's going to collapse. This is one thing that makes me actually very bullish about open blockchain networks, is because we're going to have to find alternative tools that don't become political footballs in geopolitics if we're going to have actual free and open global markets.
But I think that to Friederike's example about Gnosis, there's a distinction between coordination within a group of participants in a blockchain network and coercion. And in the case of SWIFT is being coerced
But but any individual validator can be coerced, right?
And will be.
And I mean, so kind of the thing is, Gnosis is 300,000 validators, right? I mean, not as many individual entities, but kind of like we still had to make the case to them that this is the right thing to do, and kind of like they had to press the button themselves to kind of upgrade their node or not upgrade their node, and kind of like in the end, most of them decided to upgrade their node, so kind of the soft fork went through. But kind of like if you have a three-letter agency kind of calling you up and saying, "Oh, Sebastian, you're processing some really dodgy transactions here. This is the dynamically updated list of things you shouldn't be processing, and please make sure you subscribe to this, and it informs your validator at any given time." That's a totally different situation, right?
Right. I mean, I think that's true, but I think that we need to make sure that our systems are resistant to coercion, so that
right, and maybe privacy fixes this, but like where
humans are not resistant to coercion.
And sure, and the original project of Satoshi and the project of Vitalik and the larger Ethereum community is not necessarily to ensure that validators are incapable of all malfeasance, but that there are so many validators that even if some are like regularly censoring or blocking, either because they've been coerced or because they are themselves not interested in a free and open blockchain, there will be some minority participants on the network, like located in far-flung areas of the world, who will continue to put things in in the blockchain, right? But I think
no longer true.
Kind of
so as long as kind of like you have this attestation thing, right? Because then you kind of need a 2/3 majority kind of like to attest to this. So kind of like not only do you need a block builder who knows this, but you also need kind of like to lock out and have 2/3 of the attesters kind of be on the non three-letter agency list.
I'm just learning about this here at DevConnect, but this proposal Fossil, which would be a Ethereum improvement proposal wherein block builders would have to sort of be mandatory, it'd be required to include the transactions that are validated by like a committee of some 16 or something like that. And there'd be minority members in that committee who might be the people likely to put in transactions that aren't wanted by the majority of the staking power on the network. Like, this is interesting because it's like, oh, let's rebuild censorship resistance in a world where we're starting to lose it because we don't have those far-flung validators on chain. This is actually very bad from a regulatory standpoint if you don't get this with privacy, because now an American staking individual or company is going, if they want to build valid blocks, is going to be forced to include transactions in the block that might violate, say, OFAC sanctions law. And I don't know what their defense is going to be. If it's a plain text transaction that clearly actually can be read by law enforcement or anyone with chain analysis or blockchain analysis tools that shows North Korea using the Ethereum blockchain, you had to put it in your block. They come to you as a validator and say, why did you put this sanctioned transaction in a block? And you say, well, the Ethereum protocol demands that I do it. And then they say, well, you don't have to be on the Ethereum protocol, right? You violated sanctions law.
But I think kind of like, I think there's an interesting distinction here, because kind of like the kind of like putting not putting certain transactions in blocks. This is currently the status quo, right? I mean, this is, and it's been for years, but kind of not attesting to them. This is new.
This is new. Okay.
Right. So it's that hasn't been done before. Clearly, it can be done, but yeah, and I think, I mean, I think it'll happen in due course, but kind of like it just drives home kind of like how we need to improve systems such that you have no way of knowing what you're validating.
Be actually blind, not willfully blind, and certainly not just like eagerly looking and being like, yeah, sure, I'll get that one, and then wait for the knock on the door. The case that Coin Center has recently worked on that really brought this into focus for me just before DevConnect here is actually the Pereira Bueno case. The Pereira Bueno brothers are the guys who found the exploit in the MEV Boost software, and then sandwich attacked the sandwich attackers. And
that was hilarious.
It was hilarious. What's kind of not hilarious and rather terrifying is that you could have imagined that the victims, because they also just lost in cutthroat competition. They didn't actually I don't think they're criminal victims, but the victims of that exploit, they could have brought a civil case maybe and said, like, you misused the MEV Boost software in a way that hurt us. We want to reclaim our $20 million. That didn't happen. That would have been bad enough. What actually happened is prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, federal criminal prosecutors, brought a wire fraud case against the brothers, saying your behavior on the Ethereum blockchain as a validator is fraudulent, is wire fraud, because you were not, and this is a quote from the jury instructions that they actually asked the judge to provide the last moment in the case a couple weeks ago, because you were not an honest validator.
But this is absurd because kind of like the entire point of MEV Boost is that kind of like you extract from unwitting users of kind of whatever DeFi protocol.
Yes.
Like, so, let the robbers rob in peace.
Yes. Well, and not even let the robbers rob in peace. It's just like you wouldn't go to a marketplace that is known for having established rules of commercial conduct that are effectively like if you were the highest bidder, you win. It doesn't matter if you made people think you were going to bid lower earlier or bid higher earlier. Like, if this is a market where the expectations of all the participants is that like people will profit maximize up to the bare rules of the protocol, then there is no fraud or misrepresentation. Everyone knows that in the world of minor extractable value, people are going to compete to extract as much maximum extractable value as much as they can get out of the protocol. And that might be not desirable, but we intend to fix that using technology, not layering a whole system of duties and honor that would then be enforced by criminal prosecutors on top of all validators, because if that's what happened, we'd be in a very bad situation. And there's specific claims in that prosecution because they did equivocate according to the Ethereum consensus rules. They presented two, blocks that can't be reconciled with each other simultaneously, for which they got slashed. And so in a highly technical, like going all the way back to Satoshi's white paper, what is an honest chain, they did something that is not honest validation. They equivocated. But this is not dishonest commercial conduct in the wire fraud sense, where they made a representation to someone that someone relied on in a fiduciary or contractual relationship, and then they were able to profit from that. And so this notion that like honest validation and dishonest validation being something that you could actually criminally prosecute just further indicates that we're going to have a huge problem with transparent ledgers, wherein the government's going to see validator behavior and figure out all kinds of ways to get jurisdiction over it, including when they're being self-interested in a way that maybe some people in the community don't want them to be self-interested, but everyone knows that they're self-interested. And it's not going to work. So we filed an emergency amicus brief in this case because that jury instruction was something the defense flagged, and we've been in touch with the defense, and they were like, we can't have the jury decide that they committed wire fraud because they were a dishonest validator. That doesn't make sense. And so we wrote an emergency brief basically explaining the history of that term honest validation within these networks and how the Ethereum blockchain and the community at large has an expected penalty, so a slashing fine or a slashing fee for exactly that behavior. And that's carefully calibrated to be actually quite modest, just to prevent constant equivocation on chain. And to think that you'd have now a slashing penalty for that behavior and possibly like multiple years in jail from a felony criminal charge completely unseats the calibrated norms and established rules within the protocol. And it just would make Ethereum not work.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a lot, but it's fascinating me lately. And
I mean, it's it breaks kind of like this closed system game theory of kind of the protocol itself.
Yep.
What struck me while you were talking is, I mean, obviously kind of like we have this entire situation way worse on a way bigger silver platter with L2s, right? Kind of like the multi-sig L2s where kind of like you can upgrade from hopefully a multi-sig and not a single address. I mean, there's also some of the EOA whatever, but kind of like where you typically have a single sequencer or a very small set of sequences. So basically, in effect, the entire chain is built by a single entity. How do you think we'll see that play out in L2s first, or do you think they'll go for the base layer?
I think no, that's going to be a very appetizing target.
Yeah,
because you'll have an identifiable criminal defendant. They have very clear control over a lot of relevant aspects of the transaction flow, if we're talking about some illicit transaction in the bundle that they sequenced. And they're probably well-moneyed defendants too, so you could extract large penalties from them because they're all like these companies that raise tons of money to build L2s, right? So it's a very dangerous state of affairs. And I mean, I've said for a long time that we need truly decentralized sequencing on L2s, and there's efforts to build that. I do feel like some of those efforts got maybe stymied or put on the back burner when, like American politics changed and everyone was like, oh, the SEC's maybe not going to care as much anymore, which is not necessarily true, by the way, but also still not the right way to build, because you should be building decentralization for decentralization's sake, not just because you're afraid of a Wells notice from the SEC. And then the other thing I would say is, like, I'm much more, for obvious, like, this would not be a surprise to anyone right now. I'm much more of a fan of like the let's find ways to have fully private blind sequencers, like an Aztec type model, so that, even if we have a certain amount of centralization with the sequencer, they are not like looking into what they're actually sequencing in a way that would make them responsible for mediating disputes, whether that's filtering out, transactions that might be related to money laundering, or whether it's just like favoring their own transactions on chain, or any number of other things for which they could be held culpable. And this is not me saying that like we should be building things that enable money laundering. It's me saying, no, we should build global neutral communications networks for things like underlying settlement, because that's the only way we're going to have a global economy that actually functions at the scale and efficiency that we want the global economy to function. This was true of SWIFT in the 80s. It was neutral. They were just moving money for Iran all the time. And that was a necessary cost of having a liquid and free and open global economy. And you say that, like, this is ultimately going to be good for human freedom because totalitarian regimes will suffer in that world, even if they get occasionally the benefit of the underlying transaction rails because they're free and open. You lock them down, you actually empower totalitarians. And so, like, if we're going to build a better system, we should be building more like SWIFT used to be, and less like what SWIFT's becoming, where it's just a fully mediated underlying settlement ledger for messages for settling transactions, let alone transactions themselves.
I'd love to talk about KYC, AML, and compliance as it relates to privacy. I have a hunch that a lot of the reasons why we have so many, let me put this another way.
Yeah.
The compliance cost to companies, to funds, not even just in crypto, just broadly, individuals, is absolutely massive.
Yes.
I don't know that there are any real estimations of what this costs to the economy, but I'm sure it's in the tens or perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, I think a reliable estimate was some firms in the U.S. spending upwards of $20 billion, just individually, and that the total cost was something like 300.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some number by a guy named Robert Pohl, who's a very good critic of anti-money laundering. We've also published a report recently, so I hope I'm not misstating any of these. I'm sometimes bad with decimal points, but I think we're actually on target here. We published a report called Tear Down This Walled Garden. It's a Coin Center report. It was authored by myself and Ian Myers, and the first half of it, or maybe the first quarter, just lays out how expensive AML KYC is. And that would actually be fine if it had bang for buck. But there's actually more reliable estimates as to like how much illicit finance is actually deterred and how much illicit money is actually frozen or blocked in the economy. And these are they're not estimates from weird crypto libertarian orgs. It's the United Nations and the Financial Action Task Force. Their estimate of the amount of illicit funds actually seized within the global economy thanks to AML KYC is sub 1%. In fact, it's about 0.2% of all illicit funds.
And this is coming from the FATF, the very organization that is implementing pushing to implement.
The Financial Action Task Force. Yes, right. They have a stock take that actually basically puts that number up, and the UN as well. So these systems, now, a counter-argument to that is, okay, yeah, the seizure and blockage rate is actually extraordinarily low compared to how much illicit money is out there. But the deterrence is what makes it work. When a criminal goes to use one of these tools, they go, no, I have to put in my mother's maiden name. They're going to catch me now, And I'm making this counter-argument sound too weak, maybe. There probably is some deterrence, especially for like low sophistication criminals. There's no deterrence for high sophistication criminals. In fact, the very fact that financial institutions have been collecting all of these documents and keeping them in insecure facilities means they constantly get hacked, and you can buy on the black market any number of like identity credentials that you can use to open bogus accounts if you're a sophisticated criminal. So sophisticated criminals, I don't think, are effectively deterred at all by the system. If anything, they might be empowered in a way because they know they can find readily available fake documents that have been hacked from an institution that was obligated under law to collect all of them in the first place from their users. So that system is not working. And that's the point that we make in the first quarter of this paper. The rest of this paper is, okay, we're not just here to be mean to financial crime authorities. We all need to recognize that there's a deficiency here, and we all do want to stop terrorism and terrorist usage of financial networks as best as we can without destroying the global economy, of course. So what can we do better?
This approach clearly isn't working.
Not working. It's not working for law enforcement. It's not working for ordinary persons whose privacy is invalidated. Oh, I would also add, whenever people factor the costs of KYC, they factor the costs to financial institutions. You rarely ever see anyone actually measure the costs of, say, the global identity theft losses from people whose privacy has been compromised, or just the psychic losses of knowing that your privacy is fully compromised, which would be hard to monetize or account for, but are real, like if you believe in a right to privacy. Setting all that aside, we can do better. And a lot of the technology that's been pioneered in this space, zero knowledge proofs, multi-party compute, verifiable credentials, is actually like exactly what you need to sort of brew up in order to build a system that works better. And we're seeing some of these as like early proofs of concept prototypes, like in the Aztec token sale that's happening right now. I think you can use their own.
You can use
their own
DK passport.
DK passport, which means you create a proof that your passport you are in possession of a passport, at least in this moment, that says you're an American and this is your name, and then they can cross-check that against the sanctions list and things like that. These are still not enough, though, and this is the paper we're writing says, look, isn't this cool? These are already here. But what we really need is global, composable, user-sovereign digital identity, wherein I know I have a passport, when I can create zero-knowledge proofs of that. I have a bank account. They will allow me to attest to my balance. I have a Gmail account that's had this message history for the last 11 years, and I can actually make an attestation to that effect, and I can compose these myself into a risk score that might be recognized by some particular authority as being credibly not a criminal or credibly of a low risk. And there's some important features there. It should be multi-factor. It should be attribute-based. Maybe they don't learn my identity when I provide them this risk score. They just learn that I had the ability to construct this risk score out of credentials that I myself possessed. And it should be far better, I think, than just, oh, you want to open an account, send us a scanned version of your passport, which is a garbage version of actually putting deterrence in. So I think you can build deterrence into these systems, but you should be building them with, as much as possible, attribute proofs from zero knowledge proofs rather than identity proofs, like this is everything about me.
Right.
And they need to be modular so that we can like assemble the right series of credentials that would be difficult for a bad actor to fake, but actually quite easy for a normal person who's just a good person to accumulate.
But I mean, I have to be conspiratorial here, but my feeling is that there will be and probably is a lot of resistance to these systems because of the amount of control and information that financial institutions and indeed governments are able to collect from the blanket capture of everyone's financial data, companies' financial data, documents, etc. And then, of course, all the service providers and businesses that sort of live off of this model. I guess what I wanted to get to here. What do you think within the United States Congress and policymakers is the appetite for moving towards a world where we have more sort of ZK attestation-based KYC and AML compliance rules? Because, coming from Europe, I feel like the consensus view in Europe is that we should just collect everyone's information and know what everyone's up to all the time. I don't know if that's the same in the U.S. And in fact, at the end of the day, it's the U.S. policy that will dictate what the FATF does in the future.
That's usually what happens. Usually the U.S. says to FATF, this should be the global policy, implement it, bullies the world into doing it, and then actually often doesn't implement it for its own citizens because there are constitutional right concerns. So it's a bad I call it policy laundry, actually. Like, we'd love to impose these on ordinary Americans, but we can't. So we'll go to Brussels and we'll tell people to do it globally, and then we'll come back to the U.S. and be like, see, it's now the global standard. And then Americans will be like, actually, you can't do that with our country. Anyway, that's a digression. So to answer your question directly, like, what's the appetite? And you framed it very well in, like, maybe it's not conspiratorial, but maybe the reason people really like AML KYC is not actually deterring criminals, it's mass surveillance. And there may be some truth to that. I think that the less conspiratorial reason why there isn't the appetite we would hope is simply that if you're a regulated financial institution today, what incentive do you have to stick your neck out and try alternative modes of anti-money laundering compliance? Like, are you really going to be the bank that talks to your probably like mid-level bank examiner and says, this year we decided to stop doing KYC, and instead we're relying on these risk scores, which are actually amalgams of much more credible information about the likelihood of criminal behavior from our users, but we don't know their names anymore. No one is going to do that. And no bank compliance department is going to support their chief innovation officer going to Treasury and being like, hey, let's do this, right? Like, there's no money in it for them. There's no reason for them to do it. It's just downside risk. And so it's a collective action problem at the end of the day. We might be able to get to a better world where financial institutions and technologists could build these tools that actually make a bigger dent in illicit finance while still protecting our privacy. But who's going to be the first to do it? Government's not going to design that system. They don't have the technical competency, and it's really maybe not their place to even develop the technical competency. The private sector, as far as any individual bank, is not going to lead by sticking their neck out because there's no incentive for that. This is why we think there's this opportunity in our space, in the more novel fintech and blockchain space, for a group to get together and say, like, actually, we can do a lot better. Share these ideas with regulators who are genuinely interested in deterring illicit finance, whose day job is watching terrorist financing and just knowing that there needs to be a way to stop it. We're more concerned with that than they are with mass surveillance, like knowing whether Peter is buying the wrong books today. Domestic terrorism might kind of conflate some of these things together, and maybe that gets questionable, but in a free society, we wouldn't want to collect surveillance data on what books people are reading. So we take these ideas and we socialize them with those regulators, and ideally, and this is CoinCenter's goal for work over the next few years, actually, we're doing it under a internal project we call the John Hancock Project because it's the most famous signature on the Declaration of Independence. The goal is to see if we can actually get regulatory buy-in once we present like truly robust and viable alternatives to KYC that are privacy preserving. And by regulator buy-in, I don't mean like a strong, like, yes, if you build this, it will be 100% compliant. I simply mean a credible statement from the administration, from Treasury, or maybe from the SEC if they're starting to talk about tokenizing equities or things like that, that we are open to doing pilot programs for regulated financial institutions to do alternative customer onboarding, where a risk score is maybe preferable to a full identity documentation. Because I think if you got that signal from regulators, that starts to break the collective action problem, wherein who wants to be the first to stick their head up with a new system for deterring illicit finance, when everyone seems to be fine with the bad system that's working today, and there's no incentive or money for you to build a better system, right?
Well, I really commend you for this. I think it's a terrific initiative. Are you worried about the fact that most people just don't care? Because it seems like in principle, kind of like this will be kind of like a political fight, and kind of if you look at how much people willingly divulge of themselves and how much they use extractive services, despite the fact that there are that feature equivalent privacy preserving ones.
Yeah.
Do you think it's kind of like a cultural battle that kind of we have to win first?
So if we were just talking about changing consumer behavior, yeah, this would be fairly hopeless. But I'm talking about something.
Okay, let's wrap it up.
I'm talking about something far more narrow, which it all down. Today, even if you have a consumer who cares deeply about their privacy, when they go to open an account at a regulated financial institution, they have to submit something very specific. They have to, in most cases, it will be a photo of your passport and your face right now and that will be stored in a probably in an unencrypted database at some point in the flow of data. And that's just bad, right?
It's really bad.
And so just that is all a regulatory function. That's not consumer behavior being, not conscientious enough about your own online safety. That's literally just a rule that is an interpretation of the Bank Secrecy Act in the U.S. that says institutions need to collect this information for their customer due diligence. And that rule could be changed if you had people who cared not in the consumer base, but just in the regulatory and compliance areas. And I think there are more people that care now. Just from my meetings with people in Treasury and the SEC over the last 5 years, there is a growing awareness of how bad the current AML efficacy is. And, it's kind of like finding fun common ground with people. I hate it because it's the system that destroys my privacy, and I have certain civil libertarian ideological underpinnings. You hate it, not necessarily for exactly the same reason. You might believe in certain rights to privacy and freedom, but you hate it because it's just not even stopping criminals anymore. It's in fact stopping disenfranchised people, poorer people who are easily dissuaded from using financial services when you put up barriers to them. And it's not dissuading, hardened criminals who can easily amass a whole dossier of fake passports or passports that are not their own, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's sort of two parts to this. I mean, there is the consumer part. I feel like it's probably fintech apps that would implement this sort of risk-based KYC using attestations. I could see like a Revolut doing this, right, for consumers. But it gets so much more complicated for companies. I mean, we run a small fund, and the cost of compliance and the amount of compliance work that we have to do is just like, I don't even want to imagine like a fund twice or 3 times our size, or like a company like Gnosis, the amount of compliance work that goes into just day-to-day operations and the cost that has to the company. And if you extrapolate that to the entire economy, it's a huge number. You floated some numbers earlier, and I think it gets much harder then, because it's not just your passport and what your salary is. It's the entire organizational structure. All of your UBOs. I mean,
well, so much of it is still human driven today, which is wild, and part of the reason the system doesn't work well. Like if you had more composable proofs that are difficult to forge, and you had some ability, probably from a third party, like a watchdog organization or even the government, to recalibrate when one particular aspect of a proof, say like your say a particular financial institution gets hacked, and they were one of the ones making attestations about like past bank transaction history for civil prevention, just proof of human, or maybe that they'd KYC these people, then you need to be able to on the fly devalue that as a bundle of a risk score. Maybe it doesn't go to 0 within the risk score, but suddenly that which was providing some robustness to this risk score gets unweighted to down to like half of what it was before, because we think it's compromised. We don't think all the identity data they have is bad and all the attestations they make it bad, but it should definitely be lower in the ultimate cumulative calculation of risk. And like that's what you want. You want a system that's got the ability to observe threats and rapidly recalibrate. It's sometimes referred to as an OODA loop. It's like observe. I don't know what it stands for. It's in like military. It's like fighter pilots. They're supposed to like survey their realm and then make decisions based on new information and rapidly iterate. That's what you want in an environment with revolving threats, right? But that's not what we have right now. Right now we have like people who actually manually look at passports still, and like when you go to the airport, all the security theory is like, yeah, it looks like you. It's like, you have facial tracking now. Like, why are you still doing this? I don't know. Anyway.
How much? I think this is kind of like part of the equation, kind of like making sure that actual bad guys are more easily catchable, right? But I think kind of like you can also see it from the other side, of you actually owning your identity, because kind of like if you look at the way how we use identity services, mostly we're renting, right? Kind of like if I kind of like log in with Google, kind of like, what do I have? I mean, they have all my stuff, they have my data, they know who I am, and kind of like I am beholden to them, that they don't offboard me.
Yeah.
And same for all other kind of, there's that kind of like in Web 2, there's nothing that's truly yours. It's kind of like you are the renter for everything. And it's a huge power imbalance, kind of like, and kind of puts every single person at an enormous disadvantage. And if you could just say, this is your self-sovereign identity, and you can kind of, you can use this to validate your identity in whichever way you choose against whatever. You don't need someone else to kind of stand up for you and say, yeah, this is really Peter. I think it's super powerful.
I've started saying that, like, when you are you online, you have a different name. Like, going back to like the feudal medieval period, like where your name was like Peter Blacksmith because you were the blacksmith, right? When you're online, you're Peter Instagram, or you're NirajX.com. Like, you're not yourself. You're a vassal of a feudal lord. That's a problem.
Yeah.
This has long been discussed in crypto circles as being part of the problem. And the end goal is to be self-sovereign over your identity, over your persona online. And this does factor into things like KYC. Because the simplest way to do better KYC would be to have one big corporation that collects all of this information and generates a risk score. That is far more computationally efficient than trying to do it using disparate credentials, multi-party compute, and maybe some like anchoring on open blockchains, which require proof of stake or proof of work or any number of other inefficient, non-parallelizable processes. It would be much better if it was just one company. But then, of course, we all understand why it shouldn't be one company, because this is not just one company that collects all the passports. Now it collects your entire trail of breadcrumbs that you leave across your entire life that you want to amass into a viable proof. It should instead be the user using commonly available, transparent, open source tools and amazing new privacy-preserving technologies can amass these credentials and voluntarily themselves generate probably variously differently calibrated risk scores that might be calibrated by third parties, but third parties don't hold the underlying data. All the attestations that the person wants to make with their credentials are things that they control in a wallet that they have. So very much like the alternative to Google sign-on being like sign-on with MetaMask or sign-on with some sort of like key pair that you control. But that would need to be, there's a lot of building left to do there, obviously.
I mean, you say that entity shouldn't exist, but kind of like if you look at what Google plausibly knows about you, Peter, I mean, that entity exists, right? And multiple of them actually exist. I mean, they shouldn't exist. I think this is,
But right now, they're not identified in law as the entity that should be doing anti-money laundering verifications. They'd probably be really good at it.
They would be excellent at it.
Yeah, if you passed a law that said banks don't need to do KYC anymore, they just need to ask Google if somebody's evil or not.
Yeah.
And Google can't be evil, so that would probably be much more efficient as far as like stopping a lot of money laundering and crime. But it would also be a disaster from a civil liberties standpoint. So ideally, we need to identify in law something else that could be equivalently superior to the existing AML regime, but doesn't hand all the power to one big tech corporation or big bank.
Yeah.
And the stuff in our space is the stuff that can build those systems, though it will be a very difficult thing because we're competing against much more efficient technology companies that don't have the costs of civil liberties, which are spreading data out, decentralization, strong encryption, things like that.
We've talked a lot about privacy and identity.
Yeah, this kind of just became the privacy identity. I hope you don't mind.
No, I think
that's a great discussion.
This is perfect. Are those the things that you think kind of we need to pay the most attention to right now, or are there lesser publicized things where you think kind of like this is something that is currently overlooked that we absolutely need to get right?
I'm glad you asked the question because people who don't know Coin Center might now be mistaking me for like the Digital Identity Center. And I'm like, no, that's an initiative that we're just beginning because we realize there's appetite from regulators to try alternative AML methods that could better preserve people's privacy. Coin Center's main day-to-day work, our number one mission priority, is always to defend the developers of open blockchain networks from inappropriate regulations or unjust prosecutions. And so this goes back to our earlier discussion about, say, the Pereira Bueno case, where, you've got people who are validating on-chain, obeying the rules of the protocol, and yet the Southern District of New York wants to accuse them of being involved in wire fraud or committing wire fraud. that's not a good legal precedent to set, and it's going to discourage people from participating in these free and open networks as validators. The other big things, the things that we were definitely discussing more, say, like last year, are the Tornado Cash case. First, the sanctions of Tornado Cash, which a big win, actually, in U.S. policy was Coin Center and others challenged the legality of those sanctions. And ultimately, just this past spring, those court challenges, we won. And that means that the administration delisted Tornado Cash. So Americans are now free to use Tornado Cash again. This is actually like a very real...
Wait, only Americans or?
Well, let me be clear. The sanctions only ever applied to Americans.
Right.
That sanctions law says these are foreign sanctioned entities. Americans are not allowed to transact with them. Foreign persons could have maybe secondary liability, even though they're not Americans, for violations of sanctions law, but that's less clear. But Americans were just banned from using Tornado Cash after the sanctions came out. That was unequivocal. But
just a small tangent here. Practically speaking, does that mean that people who had funds in Tornado Cash can now take them out and,
carefully
send them to Binance and trade them back for Bitcoin or whatever?
Absolutely.
Really?
Under the law. There's the sanctions are now null, and it is as if they never existed.
Got it.
So you are not liable for sanctions violations if you now reclaim your property that was left in the Tornado Cash pool. You should be very careful doing it, and I'll just say this because many of the user interfaces to Tornado Cash, the underlying pools, are actually compromised now, from what I understand, because they kind of fell into disuse, and people started setting up like front ends that actually had backdoors that would steal your funds instead of allowing you to take them. So be careful if you are trying to reclaim property that was left in Tornado Cash from a long time ago. But legally, you're safe.
But will you ever have a bank account again? Because kind of like, even if kind of like it's no longer on the sanctions list, will it still be flagged? Will you be deplatformed from whatever traditional rates you have?
Concern, not that I had ever used Tornado Cash, but I know people who have and are just...
I have used Tornado Cash. Yeah. I've used it liberally and for good reason. So kind of it's
this is a tough one, because what you need to do to address that is to socialize the fact that there is no legal risk to a financial institution in now accepting Ethereum that came from a Tornado Cash address, especially if you know the customer who's bringing it to you. Like, you know that they're just an American who is like getting paid their salary on Ethereum and wanted privacy over their salary, like one of our co-plaintiffs in our lawsuit. But how can we socialize that amongst all the compliance departments of all the banks? So if there's a stigma that's still attached, that's something else. My point is that the law has changed. It is now technically legal to reclaim those funds and to use them. Maybe you should run them through Railgun first before taking them somewhere else. To take off the Tornado Cash funk on them. They might get new funk from other privacy tools, which goes back to our discussion about base layer neutrality. Like base layer neutrality, no one's going to ultimately end up using these privacy tools if they're still just islands of privacy within a larger transparent chain, because you'll always be like, the scarlet letter of having gone through this little privacy tool, even if you were doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
And we can also watch in real time as bad people use these tools. And that creates headline risk, and it creates, risk to the whole technology. So the sanctions are invalidated. The other big thing that happened this year, and it's bad news instead of good news, is the developers of Tornado Cash, Roman Storm, specifically, was found guilty of unlicensed money transmission in his court case in the Southern District of New York. That is a very bad outcome. It's maybe not the worst outcome for Roman Storm, because he was also charged with money laundering and sanctions evasion, but the jury couldn't reach a verdict there, so he could get reprosecuted for that or may not. But he was found guilty of unlicensed money transmission. And this, Coin Center has done tons of work on this, is just ridiculous, because Tornado Cash never had control over user funds. Certainly not the developers of Tornado Cash, and also not the Torn token holders. No one did. They were in immutable pools on chain. And FinCEN, the regulator for who needs to register as a money services business in the U.S., who is doing money transmission at the federal level, has said, you're not doing money transmission unless you have total independent control over customer funds. So you might ask, why is he then guilty in New York of unlicensed money transmission if the regulator said he wasn't ever doing money transmission? And it's because the Southern District of New York has this sort of wild theory of criminal liability for unlicensed money transmission, that transmission is something broader than what the regulator requires a license for, and they did it, and therefore we can charge them with this. And what I think, so what's really happening is it's hard to charge someone with money laundering and sanctions evasion because you have to prove criminal intent, some specific intent to actually hide some specific bad funds. And like, yes, North Korea used Tornado Cash, but that was after they published the software. And so what did they have intent to do? They had intent to publish a privacy tool, and then somebody used it for money laundering after. That's not intent to launder money. That's intent to publish a tool that people will use to do lots of things. It's much easier to charge someone with unlicensed money transmission because there's no intent requirement. All you have to ask the jury is, were they doing money transmission? And we will tell you, jury, that we legally define money transmission broadly. And did they knowingly transport criminal funds while doing money transmission? And I guess you could argue like they watched it as it happened, their software did it. So it's a much lower bar. You know, there's no need to show the jury that they intended for this to happen or wanted this to happen or directly facilitated it happening. You just say, did you have a license or not? So
it's saying that they watched their software do it and did nothing about it is like
insane, because
it's like it's like having a gun store and have someone buying the gun and then watching that guy mow down a crowd of people as he walks out your store,
right? And that's why we would not usually subject people to a strict liability regime for things that are not ongoing conduct. We subject money transmitters to a strict liability regime because they're always in control of the conduct on their platform. And so maybe the reasonable liability rule is if you're always in control, you could always stop it. So if anything bad happens, you're automatically responsible. But that only makes sense in the context of a money transmitter. If you're a software developer, having strict liability for all the things that people do with your software for failure to license it is just going to make it impossible to publish software, because everyone knows most people will do good things with the software. Some people will do bad things. If you're responsible for all the bad things people do with your software, you won't publish software anymore. So it's, as I said, Roman could have had a worse outcome as far as like jail time if they'd been convicted of money laundering and sanctions evasion. But the fact that he was found guilty of unlicensed money transmission is a very bad precedent for this space, because that charge could be brought up against almost anyone in this space, because their theory of what is money transmission that requires a license is any facilitation of the movement of tokens on chain, which is something that like everybody who's involved with cryptocurrency has done in some way. And most of them, unless they're like Coinbase, have not gotten a license to do it. So this is a very bad precedent. It needs to be challenged at the appeal level. So we're hoping that Roman will appeal his guilty verdict. Coin Center is also supporting a civil litigant, Michael Llewellyn, in Fort Worth, Texas, who is a developer who wants to release a privacy-preserving crowdfunding tool. He calls it Pharos, and is willing to sue the Department of Justice for declarative judgment before he publishes that tool to get clarity from a judge that publishing that tool without licensing with FinCEN will not be a felony, will not be unlicensed money transmission. And Coin Center is supporting his lawsuit. So we have sort of multiple paths to address this particular threat, legal threat to the permission, the freedom to build these permissionless systems. We also have a legislative effort. There's a bill moving through Congress called the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which would create a safe harbor for non-custodial developers. And I'm actually optimistic. It already passed the House. It might pass the Senate. There's like a good chance we'll actually get a legislative solution to this problem as well. This is the day-to-day work of Coin Center. And now we are all increasingly interested in privacy-preserving alternatives to KYC, but most of our work is in the trenches, in the courts, in the legislature, trying to protect developers from inappropriate liability for other people using the software to do bad things. So,
if you had to make a prediction, one thing that we don't yet see coming kind of like from the regulatory sphere for the next 12 months, what would it be?
You know, this is actually an interesting one. People might be expecting me to say like something scary and bad. The thing that's surprised me most recently that I think a lot of people haven't grokked yet is that the SEC, which until recently was a very aggressive regulator in this space, interested in going after even people who were potentially good actors, trying to do their best to comply. The SEC has done a 180, and actually in a very good way. Hester Peirce, commissioner there, and the new chairman, Paul Atkins, they are legitimate. They are very genuine when they say they want to tokenize everything, which is actually like Paul Atkins gave a speech about this. And they are also very genuine. They talk about financial privacy. Commissioner Hester Peirce gave an amazing speech in defense of financial privacy, where she said we should celebrate rather than attack the availability of technologies that will recreate transactions that are like the transactions our forefathers understood when they wrote the Fourth Amendment. That if I pay you in some coins or some dollars, there's no record of that transaction, and there's no way to surveil that transaction in a warrantless way. So between tokenizing everything and technologies for financial privacy are important and should actually be celebrated rather than attacked. The SEC sounds ready to do a lot of proactive things in this space to enable the kind of global and open and fair and liberal financial system that we want to build. And
this open and liberal financial system and SEC in the same sentence is not something that I had on my bingo card, but it's
And lots of people are now aware of this, but I think I still talk to people who are like, should I go in and talk to Commissioner Peirce about the very potentially important tool that I'm building, or is that scary? Should I find a way to say that like we can still preserve the role of, say, transfer agents and other intermediaries in the system because they're wary of like going full tokenized? And I'm like, not necessarily. Like everything's on the table, I think, there. And like there isn't necessarily right now amongst the commissioners a desire to re-intermediate when that re-intermediation of securities transactions is inefficient and unnecessary. So I think like just fully tokenized equities are on the table. And I think private transactions are on the table. Now, there is an interesting thing here where obviously we're not going to have a world where, you know, North Korea could steal a bunch of U.S. equities in tokenized form and they're not going to find a way to cancel those shares. So we will still need tools for identity and compliance on these perhaps permissionless new securities ecosystems. But that's, again, part of why I'm interested in finding like privacy preserving alternatives to the ineffective KYC regimes we have today, so that we can find ways to like figure out what the security issuer's liabilities should be or obligations should be vis-a-vis the wrong person getting a hold of the U.S. equities that they issued. But there's ways to address that in a tokenized environment that aren't like just rebuild a transfer agent who's a person who's just like got a list of names as shareholders and is like, well, we can't send that to him, you know, like something better than that.
So tell people where we can learn more about Coin Center and support your work. So I think it's very important work.
Thanks, Sebastian. So all of our work is publicly available at coincenter.org. This report that I mentioned on digital identity is one of the more recent things we publish. And also, I think more people should take a look at that amicus brief we filed in the Pereira Bueno case about MEV Boost. Whether you're interested in minor extractable value or not, it sort of helps tee up why there's this existential threat to neutrality of the base layer, in part because of the transparency of the transactions on it and the inevitability of regulators or prosecutors inferring legal duties onto validators and then arresting them for failure to obey those duties. So that amicus is also up on our site right now. Yeah.
Super cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
It was a pleasure. Yeah.